Hi, Shalom. This is Rabbi Sachs. I have a little bit of technical difficulty with my computer, so I'm coming to you from my cell phone. So I'm hoping that you can hear me okay, and you are able to see me okay. So welcome to the Chai Academy, and welcome to our course in modern day Israel. So we have this the last time we met, we discussed the 67 borders, the 67 war, the miraculous war, the 6-day war, and which in 6 days Israel's land was 4 times as much as it was. So there was a war. Many Arab nations got together to fight against Israel. They felt this time was right. This time they could beat Israel, wipe them off the map. However, it was not meant to be. Israel gained territory down south in Egypt, which it did relinquish. We'll talk about that. Israel gained territory up north in the Golan, a very strategic position for Israel to be in. Rather than them looking up at their enemies, they're now on top of the mountains, and they can look down on their enemies. That they will never relinquish. It makes no sense, and it will cause a lot of lives to be lost. Then the last thing they gained was Jerusalem, which, of course, in Jerusalem was the most important site for the Jewish people. Jerusalem was where the temple was. So they did gain the entire Jerusalem, and an interesting tidbit is that they lost a lot of lives in the fight. Moshe Dayan was fighting for Jerusalem, Menachem Begin, etc., all fighting to regain Jerusalem, but they didn't want to use artillery shells because of the holy sites. They didn't want to ruin the archaeology, and they didn't want to disrespect, etc. So it was a very tough war, but they did win, and they reclaimed something called the Western Wall. So the Western Wall is, just so we're clear, was not a temple wall. The temple was destroyed in its entirety. The Western Wall was the west wall of the Temple Mount. So the temple was itself on top of the Temple Mount. This was surrounding the Temple Mount. Now it was a thick wall, big wall. I guess it was too much. It was too much for them to destroy it. So they left it. They left it there. And for thousands and thousands of years, Jews, when they made pilgrimage from different parts of Israel, or if they came in from a foreign land, they came to the wall, and it was the holiest site we have, and we prayed there. The Gentiles called it the Wailing Wall. We Jews do not call it the Wailing Wall. We call it the Western Wall. It was holy. And there's a little bit of history there, is that until 1967, or until a little bit earlier than 1967, it was used as a garbage dump. For 1,000 years, people used to bring their garbage and their waste, they used to bring to the wall. They used to bring it to the wall and dump it there, because they wanted to show, they wanted to bring indignity onto the Jewish people. So they used to bring the garbage. In fact, the gate closest to the Western Wall, so not the Yaffa Gate, not the Zion Gate, but the one down the hill near City of David, that gate is called the Dung Gate, and it's called the Dung Gate for a reason. And eventually the garbage was removed. By the time the Jews were able to get there, there was no garbage there, And it was the first time since 1949. Once again, Jordan made a deal after the War of Independence. So in January 1949, an armistice was signed, and the armistice was peace, peace. And Jordan has East Jerusalem, the Jews have West Jerusalem, and Jews are invited. This was in print. Jews are invited to go to the Western Wall. It never happened. Jordan, the Husseins, did not allow Jews to go to the Western Wall. One Jew, even one Jew, to the Western Wall. And finally in 1967, and we've been coming ever since. Right? Moshe Dayan, when he got to the wall, he wrote on a piece of paper and stuck it into the wall, and that basically started a custom of people writing and putting in little scrolls in their in the Western Wall. It is alleged, by the way, when they say walls have ears, they're referring, of course, to the Western Wall. It's where our prayers, it's the closest spot that we have, and our prayers ascend to God. So that was as far as the wall. So 1949 to 1967. In 1949, we were given the land. In 1948, the land was divided before the war took place, and the Arabs could not accept it. In 1967, they warred against us, and we reclaimed land. So you would think that's when the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, came about in 1967. That's not the case. The Palestinian Liberation Organization came to be 1964. So this is before the 67. This is before the 6-Day War, 1964. Good morning, good morning. So they did not have, it's interesting, they couldn't even, the PLO, which was founded, by the way, not by Arafat. It was founded by a fellow named Ahmed Shukare. And Ahmed Shukare, he founded the PLO, and he said we have to get every Jew out of Palestine, and it's called Palestine, and that's when the myth first came to be. And they said, they asked him, what is your goal with the Jews of Palestine? They said, those that survive can live in Palestine, but none will survive. So, two things. One is the PLO charter was the destruction of Jews. It eventually was taken over by Arafat, but it was not founded by Arafat, and that's a common myth. Secondly, is their goal was to destroy in 1964. You could say they have a legitimate gripe in 1967. Well, you took land. It's not such a legitimate gripe because you waged war, and we annexed it when we won the war. But even if you want to say the PLO, just to show you the insincerity and the dishonesty, the PLO was in 1964. They'd like you to believe it was 1967, but it wasn't. So Arafat eventually took control, and he had a view that every single Jew is an enemy. Every single Jew is an enemy. It did not matter. It did not matter what age Jew. It didn't matter where the Jew was living. And killing, it was absolutely justified, completely justified. All Jews are enemies. Therefore, the PLO killed elementary school kids. Elementary school kids. They killed them. They threw off Klinghoffer off a boat. I don't know if you remember. They hijacked a boat, and this guy was in a wheelchair, and they just wheeled him right off into the waters, finished, dead. Right? They killed the U.S. ambassador to Sudan. They killed him. And then they began their favorite hobby, which was hijacking planes. Right? So that started in the 60s. Right? In the 60s, they hijacked planes. The reason why we have security, you know, where you had to go through these magnetometers, and you had to go through this, that, and the other, and the TSA, which was called by a different name earlier, was because of the hijacking by Palestinians, right? You know, and Entebbe. Right? One of the worst things they did was in 1972 was the Munich Olympics. Right, so they killed 11. They kidnapped and held hostage 11 Israeli Olympians, the prime, right? Eventually they killed them, but that was the PLO. And it's interesting to note the head of the Olympics back then in 1972. We cannot be remiss; he has to be mentioned, and his name is should be remembered. So it was Avery Brundage. He was the head of the Olympics. While this hostage situation was taking place, while 11 Olympians could not compete and Israel was out because they were dealing with this, he allowed the Olympics to continue. Instead of saying, okay, this is atrocious, this is terrible, this is, you know, we have to stop the Olympics, this is not what the Olympics is all about. Instead of doing that, Avery Brundage in 1972 said the Olympics must go on. What a horror. What a horror. And he did not cancel the Olympics. Right? So, of course, if you don't cancel the Olympics, or if you don't postpone the Olympics until this saga is over, you know, people are distracted, and they're watching the Olympics. It was a particularly egregious. It was a particularly egregious act because they went after Olympians and they went after foreign soil, and there was a very famous or infamous payback when this happened. Israel, after it concluded, Israel sent hitmen. There's movies about it, there's books about it. Israel basically sent hitmen all over Europe and the Middle East, and basically assassinated anybody that was involved in the execution, the planning, the implementation, the execution of this horrific event. And they killed practically everybody. Of course, the person they didn't kill was Arafat, and he led a long life. Part and parcel of Arafat's legacy was that he tried to be, and he was successful. It took him a while. He was successful in coming to the UN, right? And he was able to make a speech at the UN, an impassioned speech. He basically, which he said, you have to choose. You have to choose an olive branch or terrorism. And he was referring to terrorism as far as the Israelis. Now, the Secretary General of the UN at that time, Kurt Waldheim, right, was a particular Nazi, and a Nazi sympathist, Nazi sympathizer. So he invited Arafat to speak, but the U.S. would have nothing of it. The U.S. they stood behind Israel. Right, the Secretary of State at that time was Henry Kissinger, and he said there's no way that Arafat, the PLO, the Palestinians, they're not going to be recognized as anything legitimate. Nothing. They will have no legitimacy unless they acknowledge UN Resolution 242 and UN Resolution 338. Essentially, the UN Resolution 242 was Israel's right. It had many, many things. So first and foremost, it was Israel's right to exist. Right? So that's the first thing. The other thing was that you have to renunciate all terror, and this is part of the UN. This is part of the UN. This is not the U.S., but Kissinger enforced this. He said as long as they don't renunciate all terror, and they didn't, There was that conference where the Conference of Arab Nations, where they decided this is the best approach. Right? So as long as they don't renunciate terror, and as long as they do not accept the UN resolutions 242, 338, you cannot bring them into, and they are not legitimate, and no UN person or no US government member is allowed to have any dealings with them. I don't know if you remember, there was the UN ambassador. His name was Andrew Young. He was a black pastor, minister, who went into politics. Then he was the mayor of Atlanta, I believe, and he was very active. Anyway, he became the UN ambassador, and he was forced to. He was in the Carter administration. He was forced to resign because he was having illegitimate talks with the PLO, and it was such a scandal because the U.S. was completely rigid here. That you have to renounce terror, which never happened, and you have to acknowledge the UN resolutions. So Andrew Young was forced to resign and was under the Carter administration. No surprise. Carter, who I believe was the founder of modern-day terrorism, in 1979 he made such mistakes with Iran, and of course Iran today is the money of terrorism, and for many years, Iran until today funds terrorism, enjoys terrorism, thrives on terrorism, etc. Pays Lebanon and pays the PLO and pays the PA, and it was all because of Carter's decision to get rid of the Shah and bring on the Iran Revolution. So the fact that Andrew Young was the UN ambassador and he was having secret meetings is no surprise whatsoever. Carter has a lot of repenting to do. But regardless, let's move on. In 1989, Arafat got smart, and he said there's no way he can, there's no way he would be able to get anywhere if he doesn't give some type of recognition. So what he did was he made an ambiguous, gave out an ambiguous, it was an ambiguously worded statement, basically accepting Israel's right to exist. Now, because it was, remember, this war has been going on since 67, and this is 1989. So currently, then the Secretary of State George Shultz, right? So he initiated political talks, and it is and which led eventually to the Oslo Accords in 1993. So now George Shultz, he was not the brightest knife in the drawer, but he was our Secretary of State, and he it was because of Carter's thing. George Shultz jumped on it, and which actually led to more bloodshed. Now, what happened was from 1987 to 1993, there was this horrific thing called Intifada. It was the first Intifada. The Intifada was basically means rage, or it means payback, or I don't even know what Intifada means, but essentially that every single person in Palestine was asked to do damage to the Jews. So there were bombings, there were beatings, there were killings. Now, more Palestinians were killed than Israelis, and people had problems with that. You know, it's amazing. You're a couple of guys, you beat up a Jew, and then you're shot dead by anti-terrorist unit. How could you shoot him dead? Well, they were killing a Jew, but it was the Intifada was terrible, and it lasted until 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed. I don't know if you remember. It was President Clinton, and it was Arafat, and it was Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated because he shook hands with Arafat, and he was even conceding that to give territory. I will tell you that George Shultz, the reason why I say he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer is because he went from being a strong anti-PLO man, and he made certain positions known, and the rest of the world were actually not as strong as George Shultz was. So he wasn't listening to world opinion. Finally, when he caught on, he made this drastic move of talks with Arafat. I was actually in La Paz, Bolivia in 1988, in the summer of 1988, when George Shultz, there was an attempt on his life, and he was there with his wife. And I was actually walking the streets when there was mad rushes, a mad rush from everywhere, and I stopped. I didn't understand Spanish, and people finally, I spoke to somebody. He said they're trying to kill Americans. They just killed George Shultz. They shattered his window, but his wife's window, but he didn't get a scratch. Neither did she, but they tried to kill him. And I'm an American, and I was petrified, and I ran into Eastern Airlines building, and I hid behind the counter there. But it was that summer of 1988. So he was not a liked man. In La Paz, actually, it was because of his war on drugs. So it was the drug cartel that didn't like him, tried to kill him. It wasn't any PLO. So anyway, so he was behind the times, and then when he finally caught on, he started to have direct talks with Arafat. Oslo basically led to a 5-year agreement that there will be peace. You have to accept peace, which Arafat agreed, and he says, and there has to be withdrawals. And the Palestinians have the right to self-govern, which was basically they're allowed to have the Palestinian. They're allowed to have their own police. They're allowed to have now weapons. They're allowed to control borders. They're allowed to, give out, have their own justice system, etc., etc. And the goal was that at first Israel would withdraw from Gaza, and then Israel would withdraw from Jericho, which they built a big casino then. They were raking it in, the Palestinians, until, because of violence, mismanagement, it ended up closing. So Israel would withdraw from around Jericho, and then eventually Israel would withdraw from the West Bank, and Israel would also withdraw and put it on the table to discuss Jerusalem. The final talks would be about Jerusalem, essentially. The Arabs wanted Jerusalem, and especially the Old City, because that's where Muhammad, etc., the second holiest place, but Israel, it was their city, so the talk was maybe make it an international city ruled by both parties, but that was to be discussed. Right? What was also to be discussed was refugees. Now, most people say, okay, it's the refugees of the Arabs, because when Israel came in 1948, a lot of Arabs fled. Jordan made big mistakes, and then 1967 came, and there was further mistakes made by the Palestinians, etc. And there was a refugee problem. But that wasn't the only refugees the Oslo addressed. But people don't know about this. They don't know that in the Oslo Accords, it was granted there was 550,000 Arab refugees that were displaced. But there were also 700,000 Jewish refugees that were displaced in between 1948 and 1967. But so it's not only about the Arab refugees. There were Jews, 700,000 Jews, kicked out of their lands, maybe more, with no compensation. They basically took over their homes, they took over their businesses, they took their money, and they had to run like vagabonds in the night, or risk being killed. If you and 1989, 1989, which is more recent. 1989, there was the Iran. The Jews had to leave Iran and leave their money, and their money was confiscated. The businesses were confiscated. There's a movie about that, by the way. It's called September in Shiraz. It's when Carter let the revolution happen. So you can it's on Netflix, I believe. September in Shiraz. You'll see exactly what happened to Jews, and this happened all over the place. So there's 700,000 Jews. So that was also part of the refugee crisis. Now, what was the UN Resolution 242? 338 was simple. 338 was a ceasefire to the Six-Day War and work on peace. 242 was is the basis of what we have today. So it was the basis as lasting peace in 1948. 1967. It was there should be a lasting peace. There should be a withdrawal from territories that preceded the 1967 war. In other words, and this is in dispute. It's Israel once again got territories in 1967. So the UN ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Arthur Goldberg, he said, hold on, it doesn't mean withdrawal from all territories. It doesn't mean. It means some territories. It's because it said from. And once again, they're not withdrawing from Jerusalem. They're not withdrawing from. So work on it. It doesn't mean that you have to withdraw from all the territories. And he was backed up by an anti-Semite, actually. So there was the British ambassador, the UK ambassador, Lord Caradon, right? He said it's wrong to demand Israel to withdraw and give back all the territories. The words he used was, it is undesirable and artificial for the Jews to do that. He said it needs to be talked about, but you can't expect Israel to just withdraw. These in the 48, they were just made up lines. And now let's talk about it. There's people on the ground. There's facts. There's how many Jews are there and how many Arabs are there. We have to talk about it. So that's what Lord Caradon said. His understanding of 242. So Begin, based on 242, he actually gave back. He gave back Gaza. He gave back Egypt, right? And he signed that peace accord with Sadat, who was immediately executed, assassinated. But he did give back, right? But part of 242, by the way, is that you got to live in peace, and that never happened. And if you think about it, in 1993, after Oslo was signed, and Intifada 1 stopped, Intifada 2 started. It was frustration that they thought they're going to get their land immediately, and they thought it was such a major victory, but it didn't happen. There was discussions, negotiations. There was stalled negotiations. Arafat actually had a chance to do incredible things for his people, but couldn't bring himself to sign with Bill Clinton. So Intifada 2 started. And once again, there was 1,000 Jews killed, but there were 2,000 Palestinians killed. And so the UN resolution of 242 to live in peace was never kept. Right? So 242 is not is a work in progress. Is a work in progress that you got to live in peace. You have to work out the territories. You have to make deals, and Israel's been trying to do that. They're saying, okay, so where you have Jewish settlements, because that's part of 242, where you have Jewish settlements, we're willing to trade land for existing Jewish settlements. We'll give you part of the land we conquered back in exchange for the settlements. And it just can't come to pass. Arafat could not bring himself to sign, and we're in the same predicament we were. The only difference now is that we gave back Gaza, and that was unilaterally. The Jews gave up Gaza under Arik Sharon, because there were 8,000 Jews living in Gaza, and they were surrounded by walls. But Israel still retained the right to protect Israel, including the sea, including the land surrounding Gaza. So you can live in Gaza as you will. If you do a Google search of Gaza, and you will see much poverty. You will see many streets that have been bombed by the Israelis. You will see many streets where people live in poverty. But that's only part of the story. There's certain parts of Gaza where the heads of the Palestinian Authority, they don't live there anymore, but they built, Hamas lived there. You will see mansions larger than Beverly Hills. You will see in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, the very Gaza Strip that they say poor Gazans, poor Palestinians, you will see how the money is being basically it's being channeled away from the people, and it is rather going into the hands of the leaders. We've discussed this before. By the time Arafat died, he had accumulated wealth of millions upon millions of dollars. Abbas has millions of dollars. Personal wealth, which was designed to go to the Palestinian people. So this recent act that was signed, that 250 million going immediately from Biden's administration, our taxpayers, to the Palestinians, you know where it's going. You absolutely know where it's going. It's going to fund terror. It's going to the pockets, to enrich the pockets of Falcon Enterprises, which is Abbas's children. They own the cigarette factories. They own the private airfare, the airports and airplanes, Falcon Aviation, Falcon Tobacco. They own Falcon Lottery. This all goes into the hands of Abbas. So it is sad, but true. Let us hope and pray for peace, and we will continue the course tomorrow.